Hi, my name is Benjamin. I have a story for you that transformed my life. It all started on Passover. It was the time when Jerusalem came alive like no other. The streets thrummed with the footsteps of pilgrims who had traveled from every corner of Judea, their voices raised in prayer and song. Merchants shouted over one another, selling lambs for sacrifice, spices and wares. The air was a blend of incense, roasted meats, and the faint tang of dust kicked up by the crowds. Yet, amid this familiar bustle there was something different in the air. Attention. A weight I couldn't ignore. I was making my way through the city, drawn by the ritual of preparation, when I first heard it. Whispers, hushed yet insistent, like the crackle of dry leaves before a fire. "They've arrested him," someone said. "Jesus of Nazareth." The name stopped me cold. I turned, pretending to examine a merchant's wares, straining to catch their words. Arrested. Judged. Condemned? My heart began to race. Who among us had not heard of him? The healer. The teacher. The one who spoke of a kingdom not of this world. I had seen him myself once, just days before, as he entered the city. Riding on a donkey, the fulfillment of the prophet's words. The people had greeted him with palm branches and cries of Hosanna, a king's welcome. I had stood at the edge of the crowd, uncertain whether to join or retreat. His eyes had passed over me, and for an instant, it felt as though he saw me, all of me. Not just the scribe I pretended to be, but the doubts, the fears, the yearning for something more. And now he was in chains? Passover was the cornerstone of Jewish identity, a festival that commemorated the Exodus, the great deliverance from Egypt. For centuries, it had been a time of celebration and remembrance, a declaration of faith in the God who saves. But in Roman-occupied Jerusalem, Passover had also become a time of tension. The city swelled with pilgrims, and with them came the ever-present threat of unrest. Roman soldiers patrolled the streets in greater numbers, their eyes scanning the crowds for any sign of rebellion. At the heart of this delicate balance was Jesus of Nazareth. To the religious leaders, his growing influence was a threat to their authority and the traditions they upheld. To the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, the idea of a king of the Jews was an affront to Caesar himself. This was the powder keg into which Jesus walked, a figure who inspired both devotion and fear. I found myself wandering toward the temple. It was always the center of activity during Passover, a place where worshippers gathered, lambs were sacrificed, and prayers rose like smoke toward heaven. Yet even here the murmurs persisted. I overheard snippets of conversation, priests accusing him of blasphemy, rumors of a trial before the Sanhedrin. The knot in my stomach tightened. I remembered his words. Words I had heard on the hillside in Galilee, where thousands had gathered to listen. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he had said, "for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The kingdom of heaven. How those words had stirred something in me, though I could not explain it. They were unlike the teachings of the Pharisees, who spoke of rules and rituals. His words were life, spoken with authority, as though he had seen the throne of God himself. And yet here we were. The man who had opened blind eyes and fed multitudes now stood accused, his fate hanging in the balance. Was this how it was meant to end? The Messiah, crushed by the very people he came to save? As I lingered in the outer courts, I recalled the stories that had spread through the city in recent weeks. The raising of Lazarus. The cleansing of the temple. The boldness with which he had confronted the Pharisees, calling them hypocrites. Many had hoped he would lead a revolution, drive out the Romans, and restore the throne of David. But his kingdom was different. He had spoken of peace, of forgiveness, of loving one's enemies. And now, as the city buzzed with speculation, I began to wonder, was this the revolution he had promised? A revolution not of swords, but of sacrifice? The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the temple walls. The usual rhythms of the day felt strained, as though creation itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something momentous, something that would change the world forever. As the day wore on, I felt an urgency I couldn't explain. I made my way through the crowd toward the praetorium where Pilate held court. The voices of the people grew louder, their tones sharper. I couldn't see Jesus, but I imagined him standing there, silent and resolute as Pilate questioned him. Would he defend himself? Or would he accept the judgment of men even if it meant death? The image of his face lingered in my mind. Not the face of a warrior king or a rebel leader, but a face marked by compassion and truth. I had seen him heal the sick, feed the hungry, and comfort the broken. How could such a man be considered a threat? And yet, here we were, on the brink of what felt like an irreversible moment. I couldn't help but think of the scriptures, the prophecies that spoke of the Messiah. Isaiah's words echoed in my mind. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Was this what they had foretold? A suffering servant rather than a conquering king? It was a thought too heavy to bear, and yet it clung to me like a shadow. Passover had always been a time of hope, a reminder of God's faithfulness and deliverance. But this Passover felt different. The lambs were being led to the slaughter as they always were, but this time, there was another lamb among them. A man who had claimed to be the Son of God, now standing silent before his accusers. I didn't know what would happen next, but deep down I knew this was no ordinary day. The weight of it pressed on my soul, a reminder that deliverance often comes at a cost. Perhaps this was the cost. Not a victory won by force, but a sacrifice made in love. A love so profound it would change the world forever. The night was still, yet heavy with the weight of something unseen. The moon hung low over Jerusalem, casting pale light across the rooftops and the olive groves beyond the city walls. I had heard whispers earlier in the evening that Jesus had gone to pray in Gethsemane. It was not unusual. He often retreated there with his disciples. But there was an urgency in the tone of those who spoke his name. I couldn't resist. I had to see for myself. I approached the garden cautiously, staying in the shadows. Even at a distance I could see him kneeling among the trees, his head bowed low. His disciples were scattered nearby, some sitting, others lying down. They looked weary, their movements slow, as though the very air was pressing down on them. Jesus, though, seemed different. His posture was that of a man carrying a burden too great for any one soul. I heard his voice faintly on the wind, words that sent a shiver through me. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. There was anguish in his tone, but also a resolve I couldn't comprehend. Who was this man, praying so earnestly, yet seemingly resigned to some great trial? As I watched, a figure moved among the trees, a man I recognized instantly. Judas. He had been one of Jesus' closest followers. I had seen him many times before, always at the Master's side. But tonight, his movements were furtive, his face shadowed by something darker than the night. And then it happened. A sudden clamor of voices, the glint of torches and swords. Roman soldiers and temple guards poured into the garden, their armor clinking as they approached. Judas stepped forward and my heart sank. He embraced Jesus, calling him Rabbi, a word that should have been spoken with reverence but now felt like a dagger. The soldiers moved in swiftly, binding Jesus' hands. For a moment, chaos erupted. One of the disciples, Peter I think, drew a sword, striking out at a servant of the high priest. The man cried out, clutching his ear as blood streamed down his neck. But then Jesus spoke, his voice calm yet commanding, "Put your sword back in its place. For all who draw the sword will die by the sword." He reached out and touched the man's ear, and in an instant, it was healed. Even in the face of betrayal and violence, he chose mercy. I was stunned. As they led him away, I felt an ache in my chest, a helplessness I couldn't shake. The man who had fed thousands, healed the sick, and spoken of love and forgiveness was now bound like a criminal. I followed at a distance, blending into the shadows as they made their way toward the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. The courtyard of Caiaphas' house was already crowded when we arrived. The flicker of oil lamps cast long shadows on the walls, and the murmurs of the gathered council rose like a low tide. Jesus stood in the center, surrounded by men who had long sought to silence him. They hurled accusations, blasphemy, defiance of the law, claims of divinity. Their words were sharp, but his silence was sharper still. He stood there, unflinching as though he were above their games. I watched as Caiaphas, the high priest, stepped forward, his voice booming with accusation. "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" he demanded. For a moment the room fell silent. All eyes turned to Jesus. And then he spoke, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." The council erupted. Caiaphas tore his robes in a dramatic display of outrage, declaring, "You have heard the blasphemy. What is your decision?" The response was unanimous. "He deserves death." My heart sank. They had already made up their minds. This was not a trial. It was a condemnation. Outside in the courtyard, I noticed Peter, his face pale and drawn. A servant girl approached him, pointing. "You were with him, weren't you?" she asked. He denied it, shaking his head. 2 more times he was confronted, and each time he denied knowing Jesus. On the third, a rooster crowed. Peter's eyes filled with anguish as he realized what he had done. He fled into the night, leaving behind a trail of grief I could feel even from a distance. The council's verdict was not enough. They needed Pilate's approval to carry out their sentence. As dawn broke, they led Jesus to the Roman governor's palace. I followed, still unwilling to look away. How could a man so full of grace and truth be met with such hatred? I couldn't understand it. All I knew was that I had to see what would happen next. The morning light had barely crept across the rooftops of Jerusalem when I found myself following the crowd toward the Praetorium. The news spread quickly. Jesus of Nazareth had been brought before Pilate. The night's trial before the Sanhedrin had ended, but the Jewish leaders needed more than their own judgment. They needed Rome. They needed Pilate to seal their sentence with the power of the empire. As I approached, the air buzzed with tension. Soldiers lined the perimeter, their faces as impassive as the stone walls they guarded. The voices of the crowd grew louder, their cries blending into a cacophony of anger and desperation. I pushed my way closer, trying to catch a glimpse of the man who had captivated so many, myself included. There he was, standing silently before the governor. His hands were bound, his robes stained with the marks of the night's ordeal. Yet even in this state there was a dignity about him that I couldn't ignore. He didn't cower or plead. He stood as if he knew something the rest of us didn't. Pilate stepped forward, his expression one of wearied indifference. He was a man caught between duty and disdain for the people he governed. He looked Jesus up and down before addressing him, his voice echoing in the courtyard, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Jesus' response was measured, almost enigmatic. "You have said so," he replied. That was all. No defense, no argument, just those simple words. Pilate seemed taken aback, as if he expected more from a man accused of such claims. The Jewish leaders were quick to interject, their voices rising as they hurled accusation after accusation. Blasphemy, sedition, defiance of Caesar. They painted him as a danger, a threat to Rome's order. But Pilate was unconvinced. I could see it in his face. He didn't believe their words. He didn't see a rebel before him. He saw a man who posed no threat to his rule. Pilate turned back to Jesus, pressing him for answers. "Do you not hear the many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus said nothing. He stood there in silence, and that silence spoke louder than any defense could have. It was as if he was allowing the moment to unfold, as if he knew this was not about his innocence or guilt but something far greater. I watched Pilate closely. His expression shifted between frustration and uncertainty. It was clear he didn't want to condemn this man. But the crowd's cries were growing louder, their demands more insistent. "Crucify him," they shouted. The words cut through the air like the crack of a whip. I felt a chill run down my spine. In a moment of desperation, Pilate made an offer. It was the custom during Passover to release one prisoner, a gesture meant to appease the people. He presented them with a choice: Jesus of Nazareth or Barabbas, a notorious criminal and insurrectionist. The decision should have been clear. Barabbas was a man of violence, a man who had taken lives. Jesus, by contrast, had healed, taught, and inspired. But the crowd's response stunned me. "Barabbas," they cried. "Release Barabbas." I couldn't believe it. How could they choose him? How could they trade the life of a healer for the life of a murderer? Pilate's face darkened as the crowd's cries grew louder. He raised his hands trying to restore order, but their voices only rose in defiance. Pilate turned back to the crowd, his voice sharp and commanding, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" The reply was immediate, deafening, "Crucify him." Over and over the words rang out, relentless and unyielding. I felt my stomach turn. The same people who had shouted Hosanna just days before were now calling for his death. I saw the moment Pilate made his decision. His shoulders sagged, and his expression hardened with resignation. He called for a basin of water and in full view of the crowd washed his hands. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he declared. "See to it yourselves." The gesture was symbolic, but it did nothing to ease the weight of what was about to happen. The crowd didn't care. They had what they wanted. I stood there, frozen, as the soldiers took Jesus away to be flogged. I couldn't move. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. How had it come to this? How could the voices of a few sway the fate of an innocent man? And yet, even as I watched, I couldn't help but feel that this moment was part of something greater. As though Jesus himself had chosen this path, knowing full well where it would lead. Pilate's face haunted me as I left the courtyard. A man caught between truth and expedience, justice and fear. He had the power to save Jesus, but he chose to save himself instead. And the crowd, oh the crowd. Their cries echoed in my ears long after they had dispersed. What did they see that I didn't? Or perhaps, what did they refuse to see? As I made my way through the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed the turning point of history. This was no ordinary trial, no ordinary sentence. This was the beginning of something far greater, something that would change the world forever. And I, Benjamin, was there to see it. The sentence had been passed, and the crowd, still murmuring and shouting, began to disperse. But I stayed. I couldn't turn away, though my heart felt heavy as lead. I followed the soldiers as they led Jesus from Pilate's praetorium. The air seemed thick with despair, and the streets echoed with the sounds of preparation. Hammers striking wood, soldiers shouting orders, and the occasional crack of a whip. The weight of what was about to unfold pressed down on me like an unseen hand. I moved along the edges of the crowd, my gaze fixed on Jesus. His body bore the marks of the scourging, his back torn and bloodied, his face swollen and bruised. Yet there was something in his expression even now that struck me. A quiet resolve, a strength that defied his broken body. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't look away. The soldiers brought forth the cross, a heavy beam of rough-hewn wood, and placed it on his shoulders. He stumbled under its weight, his knees buckling, but they pulled him upright, forcing him to carry it. The crowd pressed closer, some jeering, others weeping. I could see the anguish in the faces of the women who followed, their cries mingling with the harsh commands of the soldiers. I wanted to cry out to stop this madness, but my voice caught in my throat. What could I do? It wasn't long before Jesus fell. The weight of the cross, combined with his injuries, was too much for him. He collapsed onto the cobblestones, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The soldiers, frustrated, looked around for someone to help. Their eyes fell on a man in the crowd, a stranger, a pilgrim from Cyrene. They seized him, pulling him forward. I heard someone shout his name, Simon. Simon hesitated, his face a mix of fear and disbelief. But under the soldier's glare, he moved to Jesus' side, lifting the cross onto his own shoulders. For a moment the burden was shared. I saw the briefest exchange between them, a glance, a nod. It was as though they understood each other in a way no one else could. As the procession moved forward, I couldn't help but notice the contrast in the crowd. There were those who mocked him, shouting insults and laughing cruelly. They called him a fraud, a blasphemer, the king of the Jews. And yet there were others, women clutching their children, old men leaning on their staffs, who wept openly. They saw what I saw, a man who had done nothing to deserve this, bearing the weight of injustice on his shoulders. I heard whispers among them. "He healed my son," one woman said. "He gave me back my sight," another murmured. Their gratitude was evident, but it was laced with sorrow. How could this be happening? How could the man who brought so much life now walk this road to death? As they passed through the narrow streets, a group of women stepped forward, their wails rising above the din. They reached out to him, their hands trembling, their faces streaked with tears. One of them cried, "Jesus, why must this happen? What have you done to deserve this?" Jesus stopped, turning to them despite the weight of the cross. His voice was weak but steady. "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are coming when people will say, 'Blessed are the barren, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.'" His words struck me like a blow. Even in his suffering, he was thinking of others, warning them of what was to come. It was as though he carried not just the cross, but the sorrows of the world itself. The road to Golgotha was not long, but it felt endless. Every step was a struggle, every sound a reminder of what awaited. I thought of the stories I had heard, how he had calmed storms, fed multitudes, raised the dead. How could such power now be met with such cruelty? My mind raced with questions, but no answers came. Only the sound of his labored breathing, the steady rhythm of Simon's footsteps, and the murmurs of the crowd. At one point, a woman broke through the crowd, her hands clutching a cloth. She approached Jesus, her face filled with compassion. She wiped the blood and sweat from his face, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The soldiers shouted at her to move, but she lingered just long enough to meet his gaze. Her act was small, but it was defiant, a gesture of love in the midst of hate. I didn't know her name then, but later I would hear it whispered, "Veronica." Despite everything, the beatings, the jeers, the crushing weight, Jesus kept moving. He stumbled, he fell, but he rose again. There was no bitterness in his eyes, no curse on his lips. Only a quiet determination, as though he knew this was his purpose, his path. I couldn't fathom it. Most men would have begged for mercy, but he accepted his fate with a grace I had never seen before. When we finally reached the place called Golgotha, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The hill was stark and barren, its name, the place of the skull, a grim reminder of what took place there. The soldiers barked orders, preparing for what was to come. Simon stepped back, his task complete, and Jesus stood alone. His strength was nearly gone, but his resolve remained. I could see it in his eyes. He knew what lay ahead, and still, he faced it without fear. I stayed at a distance, my heart heavy with sorrow and confusion. I had followed him this far, and I couldn't turn away now. This was a moment unlike any other, a moment that felt both unbearable and holy. As I stood there watching, I realized that this man, this Jesus, was not just carrying a cross. He was carrying something far greater. The weight of the world, the sins of humanity, the hope of redemption. And I, Benjamin, was there to witness it. Golgotha, the place of the skull. Even the name carried an air of foreboding. The hill loomed before us, barren and stark, a silent witness to countless executions. I stood on its outskirts, my heart heavy as the soldiers forced Jesus forward. The crowd had grown, some drawn by morbid curiosity, others driven by grief or anger. And in the midst of it all was him, the man who had healed, taught, and loved, now walking to his death. I couldn't look away, though every fiber of my being wanted to. My feet felt rooted to the ground, as though I were meant to witness this. To see him, the one who had stirred so much hope, suffer this unimaginable fate. I asked myself, how had it come to this? And yet, deep within, I sensed that this was no accident. This was the culmination of something far greater than I could comprehend. The soldiers worked with brutal efficiency, their faces devoid of emotion. They laid him down on the wooden cross, his arms outstretched, his body weak but still. I could hear the hammer strike, the sound cutting through the air with chilling precision. Each blow sent a shudder through the crowd. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others stood transfixed, their expressions a mix of horror and fascination. His cry as the nails pierced his hands and feet, it wasn't a scream of rage or fear. It was a sound of pain, yes, but also something deeper. It was as though he bore not just the agony of the nails, but the weight of the world itself. I clenched my fists, wishing I could stop it, but what could I do? I was just one man in a sea of voices. When the soldiers raised the cross, my breath caught in my throat. There he hung, his body racked with pain, yet his eyes still carried that quiet strength I had seen before. Above him, the inscription read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." The chief priests protested, demanding it be changed to say, "He claimed to be king," but Pilate refused. "What I have written, he said. The crowd erupted again, some mocking, others weeping. "If you are the Son of God," they taunted, "come down from the cross." Their words were cruel, cutting. Yet Jesus said nothing. He didn't curse them or plead for his life. Instead, he looked down at them with eyes that held no hate, only sorrow. And then he spoke. His voice was faint, but the words carried over the noise of the crowd. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Forgive them? I couldn't understand it. These men who had beaten him, nailed him to a cross, and mocked him as he died, how could he ask forgiveness for them? My mind raced, unable to reconcile his words with what I was seeing. But my heart felt something shift. Two others were crucified alongside him, thieves condemned for their crimes. One joined the crowd in mocking Jesus, spitting venom with his words. "If you are the Messiah, save yourself and us." But the other thief, his face etched with pain and regret, rebuked him. "Do you not fear God?" he asked. "We are punished justly, but this man has done nothing wrong." Turning to Jesus, he spoke with a trembling voice, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus, through the pain, answered him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." His words struck me to the core. Even in his suffering, he offered hope, forgiveness, and the promise of something beyond this world. By the 6th hour, the sky had darkened. It was as though the heavens themselves mourned. The sun's light faded, and an eerie stillness settled over the crowd. Some began to whisper, their bravado replaced by unease. Others fell silent, their eyes fixed on the man who hung between heaven and earth. I felt the chill in the air, a weight pressing down on my chest. It was as if all creation held its breath, waiting for something I could not yet understand. At the foot of the cross I saw them, his mother, Mary, and the disciple John. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with unspeakable grief. Yet she stood tall, her gaze fixed on her son. Jesus looked down at her, then at John, and spoke again, "Woman, behold your son." And to John he said, "Behold your mother." Even in his final hours, his thoughts were for others. His love, his compassion, it was unlike anything I had ever seen. The hours dragged on, each moment heavier than the last. The soldiers gambled for his garments at the foot of the cross, oblivious to the gravity of what was happening. The crowd had thinned, but those who remained were silent, their earlier mockery replaced by unease. And then he spoke again, my God, why have you forsaken me?" His cry was raw, a glimpse of the depth of his suffering. I had heard the psalm before, but now, spoken from his lips, it carried a weight I could not comprehend. He bore not just physical pain but the agony of separation, the full measure of human despair. His breathing grew labored, his body sagging against the nails. And then with a final breath he cried out, "It is finished." The words hung in the air, a declaration, a victory, and a surrender all at once. And then he was still. In that moment the earth itself seemed to mourn. The ground beneath my feet trembled, the rocks splitting as though they too felt the weight of his death. I heard later that the veil in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, a sign that the barrier between God and man had been shattered. A Roman centurion standing nearby fell to his knees and declared, "Truly, this was the Son of God." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. All I could do was stand there, the tears streaming down my face, and wonder what it all meant. I stayed until the soldiers came to take him down, my heart heavy with sorrow and questions I couldn't answer. What I had witnessed was more than a death. It was the culmination of something beyond my understanding, a moment that would echo through eternity. I didn't know it then, but I had just seen the greatest act of love the world would ever know. And though I didn't fully understand, I knew one thing: the world would never be the same. The moments stretched into hours as he hung there, suspended between heaven and earth. The crowd had thinned, and the jeers that once filled the air were replaced by an uneasy silence. Those who remained stood transfixed, as though they too sensed the significance of this moment. I felt it deep within me, a tension, a stillness that seemed to ripple through creation itself. The darkness that had begun at the 6th hour still cloaked the land. It was not the natural dimming of twilight but an unnatural shadow, as though the heavens themselves mourned. I couldn't explain it, but I knew this was no ordinary death. Something beyond our understanding was happening. And then his voice rang out, breaking the silence. Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani? My God, why have you forsaken me? The words pierced my heart. It wasn't a cry of despair but of anguish, a deep expression of the weight he bore. I had heard these words before, recited from the Psalms, but now, spoken by him, they carried a gravity I couldn't grasp. What did it mean? Had even God turned away from him? The bystanders misunderstood. Some said he was calling for Elijah. A man ran to soak a sponge with sour wine and offered it to him, but Jesus refused. The whispers grew among the crowd, their curiosity mixing with fear. I wanted to move closer to hear more, but I felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot by the enormity of what I was witnessing. His breathing grew more labored, each gasp a struggle. I could see the strain in his body, the way the weight pulled against the nails. Yet even in his agony, there was a sense of purpose, a resolve that defied explanation. He wasn't fighting death, he was embracing it. It is finished, he cried out. The words seemed to echo, filling the air with their finality. They were not words of defeat, but of completion. A declaration that his work, whatever it was done. And then, with a final breath, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. His head fell forward, his body slackened, and the world seemed to hold its breath. In that moment it was over. Jesus of Nazareth was dead. No sooner had he breathed his last than the earth itself seemed to respond. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, a low rumble that grew into a violent shaking. Stones cracked, the earth split, and people screamed as they stumbled to find their footing. It was as though creation itself was crying out, bearing witness to what had just happened. I heard later that the veil in the temple, the heavy curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the sanctuary, was torn in two from top to bottom. It was a sign, though at the time I didn't fully understand its meaning. But I knew it was significant. The barrier between God and man had been broken. In the midst of the chaos, one voice stood out. A Roman centurion, the man who had overseen the crucifixion, fell to his knees and declared, Truly, this was the Son of God. His words sent a shiver through me. A Gentile, a soldier of the empire, recognizing what so many of us had missed. It was a moment of clarity in the midst of confusion, a truth spoken in the shadow of death. I turned my gaze to those closest to him, his mother, Mary, and the others who had remained by his side. Their grief was palpable, their faces etched with sorrow. Yet there was something else in their expressions, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't hope, not yet, but perhaps a glimmer of faith, a trust that this wasn't truly the end. John stood beside Mary, his arm around her shoulders. I remembered Jesus' words to them earlier, Woman, behold your son, and to John, behold your mother. Even in his dying moments he cared for them, ensuring they would not be alone. That kind of love was beyond anything I had known. As the quake subsided and the darkness began to lift, a strange stillness fell over the hill. The soldiers moved with subdued efficiency, breaking the legs of the two thieves to hasten their deaths. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already gone. One of them, perhaps to be certain, pierced his side with a spear, and blood and water flowed out. Even in death, he bore the marks of his humanity. The crowd began to disperse, their earlier bravado replaced by hushed whispers. Some looked shaken, others simply weary. I remained, unable to move, unable to leave the spot where I had watched him die. My mind raced with questions. Was this truly the end? Or was it the beginning of something none of us could yet understand? I had heard him speak of sacrifice, of laying down his life for others. I had seen his miracles, his compassion, his unwavering love. And now I had seen his death. But what did it mean? What could one man's suffering accomplish? These were the questions that haunted me as I finally turned to leave, the weight of what I had witnessed pressing down on my soul. As I walked away from Golgotha, the sun breaking through the clouds once more, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and anticipation. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing: the world had changed. And I, Benjamin, had been there to see it. The hill of Golgotha had emptied, the crowd dispersing in the wake of the earthquake and the haunting silence that followed. The body of Jesus still hung there, lifeless, a stark reminder of the day's brutal events. The Roman soldiers lingered nearby, ensuring no one approached the crosses without their permission. For those of us who stayed, watching from a distance, the air was thick with grief and questions. What now? Was this truly the end? I noticed two men stepping forward, their movements hesitant yet purposeful. One I recognized as Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the council, a man of wealth and influence. The other was Nicodemus, a Pharisee who had once come to Jesus in the night, seeking answers. I had not expected to see them here, but their presence spoke volumes. Whatever doubts they may have carried, they had chosen to act now when it mattered most. Joseph approached the soldiers with an air of determination, though I could see the tension in his face. He spoke to the centurion, requesting the body of Jesus. It was a bold move. By aligning himself with Jesus, he risked his reputation, perhaps even his position within the council. But there was no hesitation in his voice. He was resolute. The centurion, after confirming that Jesus was indeed dead, granted his request. I watched as Joseph and Nicodemus carefully lowered the body from the cross. Their movements were deliberate, almost reverent. This was not the treatment of a criminal, but of someone they deeply respected, perhaps even loved. Nicodemus carried with him a mixture of myrrh and aloes, the spices used for burial. The scent was strong, filling the air as they began their work. I remembered hearing about his conversation with Jesus, how he had questioned what it meant to be born again. Did he now understand? I wondered what thoughts ran through his mind as he handled the broken, lifeless body of the man who had once spoken of eternal life. They wrapped his body in linen cloths, the spices spread between the layers. It was a painstaking process, and I could see the care in their every action. This was not the hurried burial of a common criminal. This was the burial of someone they believed deserved honor, even in death. Mary Magdalene and the other women watched from a short distance, their faces pale with grief. I overheard them whispering to one another, making plans to return after the Sabbath to anoint the body properly. Their devotion was unwavering even now. Joseph had chosen to place Jesus in his own tomb, a new burial site carved from rock. It was a quiet, secluded place, far from the noise and chaos of the city. They carried the body there, their steps slow and heavy. I followed at a distance, my heart aching with every step. As they laid him in the tomb, the weight of finality pressed down on me. The stone was large, its edges rough, as if nature itself resisted sealing this man away. With great effort, Joseph and Nicodemus rolled it into place. The sound of the stone settling into position echoed in the stillness, a sound that seemed to close a chapter none of us were ready to end. Mary Magdalene knelt near the entrance, her shoulders shaking as she wept. The other women gathered around her, offering what comfort they could, though their own faces were streaked with tears. I wanted to say something, to offer words of solace, but what could I say? What could any of us say? We were all grappling with the same question: how could this have happened? I heard one of them whisper, "He said he would rise again." The others looked at her, their expressions a mixture of hope and disbelief. Could it be true? Was it possible? I wanted to believe, but the sight of the sealed tomb was a stark reminder of reality. He was gone. As we began to leave, a group of Roman soldiers arrived. They had been sent to secure the tomb, to ensure no one could tamper with the body. The chief priests and Pharisees had insisted on it, fearing that the disciples might steal the body and claim he had risen. The soldiers rolled a smaller stone into place over the seal and affixed it with cords, pressing the official Roman mark into the wax. It was a clear message: no one was to disturb this grave. Their presence felt like an insult, a final indignity. Did they truly think we would desecrate his memory in such a way? But I held my tongue, knowing it would do no good to argue. Their orders were clear, and they would follow them without question. As we walked away from the tomb, the city was eerily quiet. The Sabbath was approaching and the streets were emptying as people returned to their homes. But in my heart there was no peace. The events of the past days replayed in my mind, the betrayal, the trial, the crucifixion. And now this, the burial of the man who had once seemed invincible. I glanced back at the tomb one last time. The stone gleamed in the fading light, a silent sentinel over the place where hope seemed to have been buried. I wanted to believe this was not the end, but doubt clung to me like a shadow. That night as the city rested, my mind refused to quiet. I thought of his words, his miracles, his love. I thought of the promise he had made, that he would rise again. Was it a metaphor, a parable, something we had misunderstood? Or was it possible that death itself could not hold him? I didn't have the answers. None of us did. But as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, one thought lingered. If anyone could overcome the grave, it was him. And so, even in the darkness, a spark of hope began to grow. Small, fragile, but enough to keep me waiting for what the dawn might bring. The Sabbath had passed, but the weight of those days still lingered. Jerusalem seemed quiet, almost subdued, as if the city itself mourned. I spent the night restless, turning over every word and action I had witnessed. Jesus was dead. The one we had followed, who spoke with authority and healed with a touch, now lay in a sealed tomb. It felt like the end, yet something deep within me resisted that finality. I heard whispers among the women at dawn. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and others were preparing spices and oils. Their love for him compelled them to go, despite the danger and uncertainty. I watched as they set out, their figures disappearing into the morning haze. I didn't follow at first. What could they do against the Roman guards or the stone that sealed the tomb? But something stirred in me and I decided to go after them. The walk to the tomb felt heavy. Every step brought memories of his voice, his teachings, his gentle rebukes, and his promises. I remembered him speaking of rising again, though I hadn't understood at the time. Could it be true? Or were those words just the hopeful musings of a dreamer? My heart battled between skepticism and hope as I approached the garden where his tomb lay. When I arrived, the women were already there, but something was wrong, or rather, something was extraordinary. The stone had been rolled away. The massive barrier that had been sealed by the Romans and guarded with such care was no longer in place. I felt a chill run down my spine. Mary Magdalene and the others stood frozen, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. I could hear them murmuring, their voices trembling, "Who could have done this?" They stepped closer, peering into the dark entrance. I held my breath as Mary Magdalene ventured in. Moments later she emerged, her face pale. "He is gone," she said, her voice breaking. "The body? It's not there." The others rushed inside, confirming her words. The tomb was empty. Before we could comprehend the enormity of what we had seen, a light seemed to fill the garden. Two figures, radiant and otherworldly, appeared near the tomb. Their presence was overwhelming, their robes gleaming like the sun. The women fell to their knees, their faces to the ground. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. One of the figures spoke, his voice calm yet commanding. "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and on the third day rise." The words hit me like a bolt of lightning. He had said it. We had heard him speak of his death and resurrection, but none of us had truly believed it. Could it be possible? Could he have risen as he said he would? While the others were still kneeling, Mary Magdalene rose. Her face, though streaked with tears, held a glimmer of determination. "I must find him," she whispered. Without waiting for the others, she turned and ran back toward the city. I hesitated, unsure whether to follow, but something told me to stay. The women remained, talking in hushed tones, repeating the angel's words as though trying to make sense of them. Not long after, Peter and John came running, their expressions a mix of desperation and disbelief. Someone must have told them what we had seen. They didn't stop to speak, rushing past us into the tomb. I followed at a distance, watching as they examined the linen cloths left behind. The burial wrappings were neatly folded, not discarded in haste as they might have been if someone had stolen the body. John stood silent, his brow furrowed in thought, while Peter paced, muttering under his breath. I could see the struggle in their eyes, the battle between logic and the possibility of the miraculous. The tomb was silent, yet it spoke volumes. Its emptiness was not just the absence of a body but the presence of a mystery that demanded an answer. I thought of his words again, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." He had not been speaking of the temple in Jerusalem but of himself. How had we missed it? How had we not understood? Peter and John eventually left, their steps heavy with uncertainty. The women and I lingered, reluctant to leave the place where the impossible seemed to have happened. Hope began to rise within me, cautious and fragile, like the first rays of dawn. As we began to move away, Mary Magdalene returned, her pace hurried, her face alight with something I couldn't quite name. She was out of breath, her words tumbling over one another as she spoke. "I saw him," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw the Lord." We stared at her, unsure if grief had overtaken her mind. But her eyes held no trace of madness, only joy. She described how she had seen him in the garden, how he had called her by name. "Rabboni," she had cried, falling at his feet. He had told her to go and tell the others, to declare that he was alive. We listened in stunned silence. Could it be true? Could the man we had seen crucified and buried truly be alive? My heart wanted to believe, but my mind struggled to grasp it. Yet, as I looked at Mary, I couldn't deny the transformation in her. The despair that had weighed her down was gone, replaced by a radiant certainty. As we walked back toward the city, my thoughts swirled with questions and possibilities. If he had risen, what did it mean? What did it mean for us, for Israel, for the world? I thought of the scriptures, the prophecies I had studied since childhood. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Could this be the fulfillment of those words? The weight of the past days began to lift, replaced by a sense of anticipation. The story was not over. In fact, it seemed it was just beginning. The empty tomb was not just a place, it was a promise. A promise that death was not the end, that hope could rise from the ashes of despair. As we returned to the city, I felt a spark of something I hadn't dared to feel since the crucifixion: faith. Faith that the one we had followed, the one we had loved, was still with us. And if he was alive, then everything he had said was true. Everything was about to change. The days after the tomb was found empty were a blur of disbelief, hope, and whispered accounts of what could not be explained. Mary Magdalene's claim that she had seen the Lord alive sent ripples through our small community of followers. At first, even those closest to Jesus doubted her words. How could it be true? How could someone who had endured such a brutal death be walking among us again? It was evening and we gathered in the upper room. The doors were locked. Fear gripped us like a vice. We feared the Roman soldiers, the temple authorities, and anyone who might label us traitors or blasphemers for following Jesus. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional whisper or the rustle of someone shifting uneasily in their seat. My heart pounded with anticipation, though I couldn't have explained why. And then he was there. The locked doors had not kept him out. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or a manifestation of my own desperate hope. But it wasn't. He stood among us, his face familiar and yet transformed. "Peace be with you," he said, his voice calm and steady. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. He showed us his hands and his side. The marks of the nails and the wound from the spear were unmistakable. This was not an apparition or a vision. This was Jesus, alive, tangible, real. My knees gave way and I sank to the floor, overcome with awe and gratitude. Around me, others wept openly, their tears mingling with laughter as the reality of his presence washed over us. Not everyone was there that night. Thomas, one of the 12, had been absent. When he returned, we told him what we had seen, but he was skeptical. "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe," he said. His doubt frustrated some of us, but I understood. This was a truth too extraordinary to accept lightly. A week later, Jesus appeared again while we were gathered. This time Thomas was with us. Jesus turned to him, his eyes filled with both love and challenge. "Put your finger here, see my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe," he said. Thomas fell to his knees, crying out, "My Lord and my God." It was a moment of profound surrender, and I saw in Thomas's face the transformation that only faith could bring. There was another account, one that stirred my heart deeply. Two disciples, Cleopas and another, had been walking to Emmaus, discussing everything that had happened. As they walked, a stranger joined them, asking what they were talking about. They shared their sorrow and confusion about Jesus' death and the rumors of his resurrection. The stranger listened intently and then began to explain the scriptures, showing how all of it, the suffering, the death, the resurrection, had been foretold. When they reached Emmaus, they invited the stranger to stay with them. At the table, as he broke bread, their eyes were opened and they recognized him. It was Jesus. And then he was gone, vanishing from their sight. They returned to Jerusalem immediately, their hearts ablaze with the revelation of his presence. One morning, several of the disciples, including Peter and John, decided to go fishing. They needed to do something familiar, something grounding after the upheaval of the past days. They fished all night but caught nothing. As dawn broke, a figure stood on the shore, calling out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" They answered no, and he told them to cast their net on the right side of the boat. When they did, the net was so full they could hardly haul it in. John was the first to recognize him. "It is the Lord," he exclaimed. Peter, impulsive as ever, jumped into the water and swam to shore. When they reached land, they found a fire with fish and bread prepared. Jesus invited them to eat, and as they shared that simple meal, the truth settled into their hearts. He was alive, not as a fleeting vision or a distant memory, but as the living, breathing fulfillment of everything he had promised. After breakfast, Jesus turned to Peter. I watched as their eyes met, the weight of unspoken words passing between them. "Simon, son of John," Jesus said, "do you love me more than these?" Peter answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." 3 times Jesus asked, and 3 times Peter affirmed his love. It was no coincidence. 3 affirmations for the 3 denials Peter had made on the night of Jesus' arrest. I could see the tears in Peter's eyes as Jesus restored him, not with condemnation but with love and purpose. "Follow me," Jesus said. And I knew Peter would, with every ounce of his being. Each time he appeared, he brought peace, reassurance, and a deepened understanding of who he was. He met us in our fear, our doubt, and our despair, transforming each into faith, hope, and joy. He was not just alive. He was victorious, over death, over sin, over every force that sought to keep us from the love of God. As I reflect on those encounters, I see the tenderness of his approach. He revealed himself to Mary in the garden, calling her by name. He walked with the disciples to Emmaus, opening their eyes through the breaking of bread. He restored Thomas with a touch, meeting him in his skepticism. And he called Peter back to his purpose, reaffirming his love and his role in the kingdom to come. The risen Jesus was not the same as the man we had walked with before. He was still Jesus, still our teacher, our Lord, our friend, but there was a glory about him now, a power and a presence that left no doubt. He was the Son of God, the Savior of the world. To see him, to touch him, to hear his voice again was to know that everything had changed. The resurrection was not just an event, it was the beginning of a new creation, a promise that life would triumph over death and that love would have the final word. I saw him with my own eyes. I heard him speak peace into the chaos of our hearts. And I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that he was alive, not just for us but for all who would come to believe in him. The fear that had gripped us was gone, replaced by a joy that no one could take away. He had risen, and because of that, we too would rise. From the moment we first saw him after the resurrection, there was a sense that everything was building toward something. Each encounter with Jesus was like a puzzle piece falling into place. We understood more of his purpose, his kingdom, and his mission with every word he spoke and every step he took among us. And yet, there was a lingering question we were too afraid to voice. What now? What would come next? The day was bright and clear, the kind of day that feels like a gift from God. Jesus had told us to meet him on a mountain in Galilee, and so we went, climbing the winding path with a mixture of anticipation and unease. Some of us had seen him perform miracles. Others had only recently come to believe after the resurrection. But we all shared one thing, a longing to hear what he would say. When we reached the summit, he was already there waiting for us. His presence was commanding yet comforting, as though heaven itself had come down to earth. We fell to our knees, some worshipping without hesitation, while others hesitated, still grappling with the enormity of what they were witnessing. I confess, even I felt a flicker of doubt. How could this man standing before us hold the destiny of the world in his hands? He began to speak, his voice carrying over the hills, firm but full of love. "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me," he said. The weight of his words pressed upon us. We had known him as a teacher, a healer, and a friend, but now we understood. He was declaring himself the Lord of all creation. Everything in heaven and on earth was under his authority. And then he gave us the command that would define the rest of our lives. "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you." He was sending us out not just to the people of Israel but to the ends of the earth. The scope of it was staggering. We were fishermen, tax collectors, and common folk. How could we carry such a message to the nations? But he didn't leave us to face this mission alone. He ended with a promise, "And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." Those words resonated deeply. He was not sending us out in isolation. His presence, his spirit, would remain with us, guiding and empowering us. It was both a comfort and a challenge, a calling that demanded everything we had to give. As he finished speaking, something extraordinary began to happen. He lifted his hands, blessing us, and then he began to rise. Slowly at first, and then with increasing majesty, he ascended into the sky. Our eyes followed him, straining against the sunlight, trying to hold on to the sight of him for as long as possible. There was a hush among us, the kind of silence that feels like the world itself is holding its breath. Suddenly, two men in white appeared among us. "Men of Galilee," they said, "why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus, who has been taken from you into heaven, will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven." Their words broke the spell of our awe and reminded us of the promise yet to come. He would return just as he had said. In the days that followed, we gathered often, talking about what we had seen and heard. The mission he gave us was daunting, yet it burned within us like a fire. How could we not share the good news with the world? He had conquered death, redeemed our sins, and given us a hope that no power on earth could take away. I often thought of his promise to be with us always. In those quiet moments of doubt and fear, I would remember his words, his presence, and the way he had transformed our lives. We were no longer a group of scattered followers. We were a family, bound by the love and mission of our risen Lord. Even as we went out to teach, baptize, and make disciples, we held on to the hope of his return. The memory of his ascension was etched into our hearts, a reminder that his story was not finished. He would come again, bringing the fullness of his kingdom and fulfilling every promise he had made. It was this hope that sustained us through trials, persecution, and even death. For we knew that the one who had ascended to heaven was also the one who would come back to set all things right. Looking back, I see that his commission was not just for us, but for every believer who would come after. His words echo across the generations, calling each of us to carry his light into the world. It is not an easy path, but it is one filled with purpose, hope, and the assurance of his presence. As I grow older, I find myself thinking more often of that day on the mountain. I remember the way his words stirred my soul, the sight of him ascending into the heavens, and the promise that he would be with us always. And I know without a doubt that his mission continues. Through every act of love, every word of truth, and every life transformed by his grace, the story of Jesus lives on. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories, but not those days. I was there, amidst the fear and the joy, the doubt and the revelation. The events unfolded like a storm, fierce and unrelenting, but left in their wake a calm unlike any I had ever known. Now, as I reflect on those moments, I see them not as separate threads but as a tapestry woven by the hand of God. It began with the news of the empty tomb. At first, the reports seemed absurd, almost laughable. Women came running breathless, claiming that the stone had been rolled away and that they had seen angels declaring, "He is not here. He has risen." The men were skeptical, dismissing it as idle talk. I admit, even I hesitated to believe. It felt too good to be true, too far removed from the reality of Roman nails and a bloodied cross. But as the hours passed, the rumors grew louder, bolder. Mary Magdalene spoke of encountering him in the garden, her face radiant with a joy I could not ignore. "I saw him," she said, "I spoke to him. He called me by name." Her words pierced my skepticism. Could it be? Could death truly be defeated? The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced. One by one, the disciples claimed to have seen him. Peter, who had denied him with curses, now spoke of forgiveness and restoration. Thomas, ever the doubter, returned from an encounter with Jesus saying, "My Lord and my God." Their transformation was undeniable. These men, once scattered like sheep without a shepherd, now spoke with a confidence that could only come from having seen the risen Lord. I saw the change in their eyes, their voices, their very presence. They no longer feared the authorities, no longer cowered behind locked doors. Instead, they spoke openly, proclaiming that Jesus had conquered death and that his kingdom was unlike anything we had imagined. It was not of swords and thrones but of love, forgiveness, and eternal life. Jesus' words echoed in my mind, "Go and make disciples of all nations." This was not a call for the select few, it was a commission for all who believed. At first, the scope of it overwhelmed me. How could we, a handful of ordinary men and women, carry such a message to the ends of the earth? But then I remembered his promise, "Surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." Those words became an anchor for my soul. His teachings, once so enigmatic, now made perfect sense. The parables, the miracles, even his rebukes, they all pointed to this moment, to a kingdom that transcended earthly boundaries. I began to see that his resurrection was not just a victory over death but an invitation to life. A life lived in communion with God and with one another. Years passed and the story of Jesus spread like wildfire. I watched as pilgrims began to walk the Via Dolorosa, tracing the steps he took on his way to the cross. Some carried burdens on their backs, others wept openly as they prayed. I saw Roman soldiers and Jewish leaders, Gentiles and Samaritans, all drawn to the story of the man who had turned the world upside down. Many came seeking healing, others forgiveness. But what struck me most were those who came simply to believe, to touch the places where heaven had met earth. I often found myself at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, marveling at how the sight of his death and resurrection had become a wellspring of hope for so many. As I grew older, I saw how his story continued to transform lives. Children were named after him, songs were written in his honor, and communities were formed in his name. His teachings became the foundation of a new way of life, one marked by generosity, humility, and a love that knew no bounds. It was as though his resurrection had not just changed history but had rewritten the very fabric of what it meant to be human. And yet, the world remained broken. Wars raged, empires rose and fell, and suffering persisted. But in the midst of it all, there was a light that could not be extinguished. It was the light of the resurrection, a reminder that death does not have the final word. I think often of the moment I first heard his voice, the moment our eyes met as he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. Back then, I was a scribe, a man of the law, struggling to reconcile his message with the traditions of my fathers. But now I see that he was the fulfillment of those traditions, the Word made flesh dwelling among us. His death was not the end, it was the beginning. His resurrection was not just a miracle, it was a promise that one day all things would be made new. And as I near the end of my journey, I find myself clinging to that promise. For I know that the one who conquered the grave is the one who holds my future in his hands. I am old now, my steps slower and my voice weaker, but the events of those days remain vivid. I can still hear the cheers of the crowd as he entered Jerusalem, feel the chill of the air as he breathed his last on the cross, and see the joy on Mary's face as she proclaimed, "He is risen." These memories are not just stories, they are the truth upon which I have built my life. And so, I tell you, dear listener, his story is not finished. It lives on in every heart that believes, in every life transformed by his grace. From the cross to the empty tomb, from the upper room to the mountain in Galilee, his love endures. And one day he will return just as he promised. Until then we wait, we hope, and we carry his light into the world,